The day of September 17, 1862 dawned in quiet. The mist clung low over the Maryland fields, shrouding fences, barns, and crops in a spectral veil. To the farmers of Sharpsburg it was supposed to be just another day, a day to gather corn, to haul wagons down dusty roads, to herd livestock along Antietam Creek. But for America, it would be the day heaven itself appeared to grow dark. By evening, the peaceful village would be awash in blood, and Antietam would be written into history as the bloodiest single day in United States history. Picture yourself standing in that misty dawn. You can hear the roll of drums far away, the jingle of metal, the groan of wagon wheels. Tens of thousands of men, boys in fact, are standing up from their camps. Some are nervously laughing, feigning not seeing the terror in one another's eyes. Others sit on the wet ground, praying softly, crossing themselves, or holding on to letters they penned in the darkness. The letters, folded into crisp envelopes, have "To my mother and to my wife and to my children" scribbled on them. And then the sound that makes all the difference, the boom of a solitary cannon. The ground shakes, birds flee, and in seconds the fields erupt with musket fire. The peaceful cornfield, before, is suddenly ripped to pieces. Men are killed in clumps before they have even glimpsed the enemy. The fight has started. By day's end, over 23,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. To put that in perspective, that's nearly the entire population of Sharpsburg multiplied several times over. It was as if an entire city had been erased in the span of 12 hours. Fathers would never return. Sons would never grow old. Families would spend the rest of their lives mourning the loss that came from a single sunrise to sunset. But Antietam was not just another battle. It was the battle that preserved the Union from disintegration. It was the battle that provided Abraham Lincoln with the authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, changing the war from a conflict about states into a crusade for liberty. It was the moment the world held its breath, waiting to see whether America would rise or fall, and it was the day soldiers, regular farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and workers ended up as martyrs and witnesses to unspeakable terror. In order to really see Antietam's legacy, you must put yourself in their shoes. Put yourself in the place of one of those men. Imagine yourself as a Union soldier, rifle in hand, standing at dawn in formation. Dew clings to your cap. You glance left and right, and you see your buddies, guys from home, your brothers, perhaps even your cousins, you don't know yet, but half of them will be killed that day. The command comes, and you advance into the cornfield. The corn is taller than your head, concealing all, but the air explodes with the crack of gunfire. Bullets tear through the corn, through the men in front of you. You hear the impact of bodies on the ground, the cries of agony, the shouting of officers bellowing forward. You tread over the dead, for there is no other option. In minutes the field has changed from gold to red. You don't see the ground anymore, just the bodies, and yet still the battle goes on. Now pretend you are a Confederate soldier, bent low in the Sunken Road. It's a farmer's lane, deepened years by wagons and cattle. This day it is your armor. You and your comrades stand in line, rifles butt on the embankment, sighting down at the blue-clad foe who move across open ground. You wait until they are near, then let fly a hail of fire. They fall in rows, but still they come. You reload, fire again, reload, fire again. The highway is choked with smoke, the noise is thunderous, and before long, the bodies are stacked so high they fill the very lane itself with a grave. The Sunken Road will never again be anything more than a rural road. It will forever be remembered as Bloody Lane, and the bridge, Burnside's Bridge, a plain stone span across Antietam Creek. Union soldiers assault it for hours, but you and your fellows on the bluff above cut them down like they are walking targets. The creek below is choked red with blood. Union men pile up in heaps on the bridge, which is only wide enough for one at a time to pass, and block the way for those behind. They don't break through until 3 hours of carnage. The bridge is captured, but at what cost? Hundreds of lives for a crossing hardly broad enough for a wagon. Such as Antietam, a location where men marched into cornfields and never walked out, a location where a quiet back road became a death trench, a location where a stone bridge became a slaughter funnel. But beyond the horror, there is the legacy. Lincoln may never have had the moment to sign the Emancipation Proclamation without Antietam. Britain and France may have recognized the Confederacy, shifting the tide of the war. Without Antietam, the Union may not have endured at all without Antietam, and yet, to the men who lived through it, the legacy was not politics. It was suffering. It was the memory of friends buried in shallow graves. It was the dreams that awoke them for years to come. It was the ring of muskets, the stench of powder, the faces of boys pale in death. Photographer Alexander Gardner arrived days after the fact, capturing the dead in stark, haunting photographs. For the first time, Americans viewed war not as glory, but as sorrow. In New York, people crowded against the glass to view the photographs, men sprawling in fields, their eyes blankly staring up at the sky. One journalist reported, "If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards, he has done something very like it." Antietam transformed not only the war itself, but the manner in which people perceived war, and so the hook is this. Antietam was bigger than a battle. It was America's reckoning, a day when the price of division was marked in blood, a day when courage and cruelty went hand in hand, a day that redefined the nation for good. As the sun went down on September 17, 1862, the field was quiet. Blazes swept through the fields, casting shadows of dying light over the bodies. The groans of the wounded filled the night air, ringing out across the hills. The stars gazed down on a changed land, a land that had been turned into a cemetery. And in that quietness, the fate of America changed. The question is not just what occurred at Antietam, but what it signified to the Union, to freedom, to the world. To recount this tale is to challenge the somberest day of American history, and to honor the men who gave their lives for the preservation of a nation. Because Antietam was not merely history, it was the blood that nourished the tree of freedom. It was the agony that bore emancipation. It was the darkness that compelled America to seek light. And as we walk back into those fields, into the cornfield, the sunken road, the bridge of blood, and the graves under the stars, we must ask ourselves, what is the real price of freedom? That is the legacy of Antietam. And it starts with one dawn in Maryland, when silence gave way to thunder, and a nation was forever altered. The sunrise on September 17, 1862, came like any other morning in the peaceful Maryland landscape, an autumn dawn over a tranquil countryside. Sharpsburg town lay still under the cover of night, its fields broad with the promise of harvest. There had been farmers who plowed this land, their fingers sowing corn and wheat, their dreams anchored in the cycle of the seasons. But today, the ground was fated to be remembered for death, not life. It would be the battleground for the bloodiest one-day battle in American history, the Battle of Antietam. With the first light of dawn breaking over the hills, an air of foreboding hung heavy. Union troops under General George B. McClellan shifted uncomfortably in their camps. Fires smoldered low, tin cups clinked, and the acrid scent of coffee burned mingling with wet earth. There were men sitting quietly, scribbling hasty letters to wives and mothers, that they would come home, although deep down inside, many of them knew they might not. Other men struggled with their muskets, cleaning their barrels, murmuring prayers under their breath. Fear dwelled in their eyes, yet so did resolve. Across the lines, the Confederate Army, with General Robert E. Lee, waited in silence. Lee had marched his men into Maryland, hoping to deliver a blow on Union ground, which would unsettle the North, and maybe gain recognition from European powers. His soldiers were exhausted, many of them barefoot, their clothes in shreds, their bellies hollow, but they had within them a hot fire, tempered by months of combat. They felt they were fighting not only for their homeland, but their existence. That belief made them deadly, even in their tattered appearance. The mist hugged the earth like a shroud, dampening sound, concealing movement. It was as if the very ground stood still, holding its breath. Somewhere in the Union lines, a drummer boy struck the morning call, his sticks thudding against skin with a beat that would resound in memory long after the day was over. Men fell into ranks, shoulders squaring, eyes cast ahead. Officers shouted orders, boots stomped out as one, and the Army of the Potomac was on the march. For many of them, it was their first battle, youthful farm lads who had never been farther from their county line than the green shag on a hog's face now stood on the doorstep of history. Their uniforms were stiff and new, muskets cumbersome and fingers still calloused from plows. Dread gnawed at them, but standing next to them were veterans more seasoned, who had witnessed the atrocities of Bull Run and Shiloh. Those men had learned the price of war, and their somber expressions spoke louder than words ever could. Today would be different from anything they had ever known. As the sun climbed higher, shafts of gold broke through the fog, illuminating the rolling hills. Cornfields waved softly, fences bordered the pastures, and the Antietam Creek snaked slowly through the fields. To a traveler passing by, it would have appeared serene, but the troops realized this land would be baptized in blood. General McClellan, being cautious, felt he had Lee trapped. The Confederate forces were stretched thin, their lines of supply weak, their troops spent, but McClellan, with almost twice the number of men, dawdled. His tendency to overestimate the strength of the enemy hung heavy over his mind. Nevertheless, this morning he was determined to move. He knew the eyes of President Abraham Lincoln and the nation were on him. A victory would shift the balance of the war over the entire field. General Lee rode his lines with steady determination. He was outnumbered, but not outspirit. He had faith in his commanders, men such as Stonewall Jackson, to stand firm. Lee's plan was not to conquer, but to remain alive. If his army survived McClellan's attack, if he managed to retreat still in being, it would be a Confederate victory. For in war, the perception was often equal to the reality. The soldiers on either side were not privy to these grand strategies. What they knew was the boots in the mud, the heaviness of the musket on their shoulders, and the thumping of their hearts. They knew that when the word was given, they would advance into a hail of bullets and cannon. They knew that some of them would never witness the sun set again. Union soldier Private William McCarter later recounted that morning, explaining how he took in a look around at his fellow soldiers, and understood that a lot of the faces he saw would disappear before the end of the day. "We laughed to hide our fear," he stated, "but in our hearts we knew death waited in the fields ahead." The stillness before the storm was eerie. Birds continued to sing in the trees, unaware of the tens of thousands of men ready to be killed. Horses snorted and stamped the earth, feeling the fear in the air. Officers galloped back and forth, their voices cutting as they issued commands. Artillerymen loaded the cannons, the iron cannonballs clinking with finality. Then, as the first light completely broke on the horizon, the battle started. One cannon bellowed, shattering the quiet. Its boom rattled over the hills like thunder, and in a moment, fields burst open. Union troops pushed forward toward a cornfield that separated them from the Confederate lines. Muskets snapped, smoke billowed in heavy clouds, and the earth shook under the fury of battle. The 17th of September morning was no longer a routine day. It was now a day of reckoning. Neighbors who would previously have sat down to eat together now stood eyeing one another through the haze of smoke, bayonets set, each believing in the rightfulness of his cause. What transpired during those initial hours was pandemonium. The soldiers yelled to be heard above the cacophony. The pungent smell of gunpowder singed the throat, and blood already stained the earth. The rising sun showed off sights too ghastly to envision, men collapsing en masse, officers felled in the midst of orders, flags carried high only to fall as their carriers were killed. But even as death swept across the lines, the men pushed on. Union troops pushed through into the cornfield, to be cut down by withering Confederate fire. Whole companies were killed where they stood, their bodies collapsing among the stalks. Survivors pushed forward, trampling over the fallen, unwilling to give in. One soldier called it walking through hell itself. The air was heavy with smoke, so thick men could hardly see more than a few yards in front of them. The corn stalks, torn apart by bullets, clattered in the wind like bones, and above it all the screams of the wounded pierced the air in a dreadful chorus that lingered with survivors for the balance of their lives. Simultaneously, Confederate troops battled just as fiercely. They were aware that they were outnumbered,
but they stood their ground grimly determined. "We fired until the barrels burned our hands," one recalled, "but still they came." The morning that had dawned with still mist and golden sunlight was now soaked in fire and steel. Every minute stole more lives. What had been a countryside of fields and farms was being turned into a charnel house. The Union advanced, the Confederates counterattacked, and the cornfield was the stage for apocalyptic slaughter. By mid-morning, thousands were dead or injured, and the fight was hardly more than half over. The Sharpsburg fields were no longer merely land, they were now hallowed ground,
consecrated by the blood of Americans killing Americans. And although nobody yet knew it, what happened that day would not only decide the war but the fate of the nation as well. The dawn of Antietam was not only the beginning of a battle, it was the day America faced the awful price of its own fragmentation. At first glance, the cornfield of the Miller family in Sharpsburg, Maryland was nothing remarkable. Lines of tall golden reeds swept across the land, gently swaying in the morning air. It was an area of development, of life, of harvest. But on September 17, 1862, this quiet field transformed into something else. A killing field so atrocious that eyewitnesses would testify later that you could travel from one side of it to the other without ever touching the earth, stepping instead upon the bodies of the dead. When Union troops charged forward that morning, their boots sank into moistened ground. The cornstalks, still moist from the night dew, tickled their uniforms as they moved forward in deep, even lines. Far off, it would have appeared like blue-coated waves spilling onto a sea of gold. Officers shouted orders, drums pounded out the beat of battle, and the men marched as a unit. Their mission was straightforward: penetrate the Confederate ranks and push them back. But the Confederates lay in wait. Concealed behind the woods and fences at the field's perimeter, Southern troops leveled rifles and artillery and waited silently as Union soldiers fell into the trap. Then, with the initial crack of musket fire, the still morning erupted. Bullets cut through the stalks with the fury of a lead storm. The corn, standing proud and tall, bent and was broken by the hail of bullets. Men fell instantly, their bodies collapsing between the rows. There was smoke everywhere, heavy and choking, biting at the eyes and scorching the lungs. In a matter of minutes, the cornfield was not a farm anymore but a furnace of death. One of the Union soldiers later described, "Guys, it appeared as though every cornstalk in the northern and larger portion of the field had been cut off as close as could have been done with a knife, and the dead lay in rows just as they had stood in their lines a few moments previous." The dirt road was little more than an old backwoods road, weathered by years of wagons, horses' hooves, and farmers' shoes. Farmers had used it to haul crops, herd cattle, and drive to their neighbors' farms. To the men who lived in Maryland, it was just a sunken road, grooved out by time and wear. But on September 17, 1862, that modest road would be given a sinister name, one that would reverberate down the centuries: Bloody Lane. By mid-morning, following the carnage in the cornfield, Union soldiers were instructed to advance again. Their gaze landed on the lane, which cleaved through the battlefield like a gash. It seemed innocuous at first sight, a trench-like depression in the earth, lined by split-rail fences and hedgerows. But for the Confederate defenders, it was heaven sent. Shielded by the earth's natural hollow, they could hunker down, out of sight of advancing Union lines, and rain shot upon anyone foolish enough to venture near. General D.H. Hill's Confederate division held the line. His troops were fatigued, but they knew the strategic significance of this natural barricade. If the Union were to capture it, they could divide Lee's army in two, and so, clutching their guns tightly, the Confederate troops entrenched, vowing to hold the line come what may. As the Union brigades took up lines and moved out towards the lane, the Confederates observed in ghastly serenity. The first wave of the Union charged, muskets shining, flags rippling in the hazy air. Officers bellowed orders, directing their men to stay in line. But before they could reach even halfway, the lane went up. A wall of musket fire thundered out of the sunken road. The rifles cracked and echoed, a rolling thunder that seemed to cleave the very air apart. Bullets ripped into the blue uniforms, bringing men down by dozens. The Union troops wavered, but their commanders urged them ahead. They leapt over fences, charged across open fields, and fell in piles before Confederate guns. One of the Confederate soldiers described it afterward: "We shot them down as quickly as we could reload. They kept moving steadily forward, as though nothing could repel them. The lane was choked with smoke, and the air trembled with the crash of the musketry. Wave upon wave of Union troops came forward, and each wave the Confederate defenders shot down. The sun rose higher in the sky, the day heated up, and the dirt road ran slick with blood. Union troops attempted to come around behind the position, but fences hindered their approach. Men were stranded out in the open, easy targets for the Southern riflemen, yet the Union never ceased. General William H. French's division assailed repeatedly, paying for each advance in lives. The Confederates, sheltered by their trench-like position, appeared invincible. From the heavens, an onlooker would have witnessed the Union ranks dwindle away, men falling in bunches, their flags dropped only to be grabbed by another who would also fall soon. The bloodshed defies description. The Sunken Road, previously a modest road, was now a river of blood. Bodies stacked up, sometimes 3 deep. Blood saturated the earth, until it hardened into mud. The smell of smoke blended with the coppery taste of blood, and the screams of the dying. Soldiers fell on the gore as they reloaded, tripping over the dead while attempting to keep up their fire. Private John Dooley of the Confederate forces later wrote, "The enemy advanced to within a few yards of our position, but the fire we poured into them was so destructive that their lines wavered, then broke, leaving the ground covered with their dead and wounded." But the Union continued to arrive. A new wave of Union troops led by General John Sedgwick arrived in the battle midday. The troops advanced into the inferno with bravery, but muddled communication and confusion made them easy targets. The Confederates opened up a killing volley, ripped Sedgwick's troops apart, and left almost half killed or injured in minutes. Survivors scrambled in disarray, their friends' cries echoing in their minds. The Confederates applauded, thinking that they had won the lane once and for all. But success makes people too self-assured, and destiny has a nasty habit of transforming triumph into tragedy. As the afternoon dragged out of morning, Union General Israel Richardson reformed his troops. He gave the order for another attack, and this time, the Union forces pushed harder against the Confederate flanks. A gap had developed in the Southern line. The troops in the lane, having fought wildly for hours, started to give way. Ammunition was low, officers were dead or wounded, and panic set in. At the moment of crisis, a misunderstanding sealed their fate. A portion of the Confederate forces retreated in error, believing they had been instructed to do so. The resulting gap in their line was too much for the Union. Union troops swarmed over the fences and poured into the lane. Hand-to-hand fighting began, bayonets ringing against each other, rifle butts cracking, fists and fury met in the confined space. Sighs of screams and curses filled the air, the ground slick with blood. Men fought like cornered animals, struggling to survive. But the Union Army numbers overwhelmed the defenders. Slowly, agonizingly, the Confederates were driven out. The Sunken Road, the fortress that had been their stronghold, was their cemetery. When the Union did finally hold it, the sight was beyond imagination. Thousands of corpses clogged the trench. Some were still, mouths open to the sky. Others thrashed in torment, crying for water, for pity, for mothers who would never arrive. One Union officer, taking in the devastation, was struck speechless. When he finally managed to speak, his own words expressed the horror. It was a ghastly spectacle. The road was literally choked with dead and dying men. For 200 yards, you could not walk without stepping on a body. The soldiers who survived would never forget what they saw. They called it Bloody Lane, and the name stuck. It became a symbol not only of the Battle of Antietam, but of the Civil War itself. A war where brother killed brother, where fields of harvest became fields of death, where a simple dirt road became a mass grave. But even in this bloodshed, there was no outright victory. The lane had been taken by the Union, but at costs beyond imagination. Thousands of their own were among the dead, given up for a line that in the larger context of the battle won them scant ground. The Confederates, though pushed back, were not broken. The carnage was appalling, but the war did go on. For the soldiers who marched away from Bloody Lane, the memories seared into their brains for eternity. They would whisper about it in reverent tones, haunted by the vision of men shoulder to shoulder dead, still in formation. They would recall the screams, the smoke, the incessant volleys that transformed a country road into one of America's most infamous killing grounds. And for the families at home, holding their breath in anticipation of news, the letters that arrived contained only sorrow.
Mothers, fathers, wives and children would be told that their own had died in a spot that had no name to begin with but would be forever known as a synonym for massacre. The Sunken Road was not just a battlefield, it was a lesson in blood about war's cost, a lesson that America, in the midst of its blackest conflict, was still far from mastering. The sun was high in the sky by the time the battle raged across the stone bridge over Antietam Creek. The morning bloodshed in the Cornfield and Sunken Road had exhausted the energies of both forces, but the conflict was hardly ending. For Union General Ambrose Burnside, the bridge was both hope and catastrophe. His instructions were unambiguous. He had to cross Antietam Creek, circumvent Lee's right flank, and deliver the decisive blow that could finish the Confederate occupation of Maryland. On any other day, the bridge would have been a commonplace crossing. It was slim, fashioned out of stone, arcing unobtrusively over the sluggish creek. Farmers had driven wagons over it for years without a thought for the day when it would become famous as a field of slaughter. But geography and chance transformed this unobtrusive bridge into a fatal trap, one which would become known only as Burnside's Bridge. The Confederates were ready for this. General Robert Toombs and his Georgian troops took up positions on the high bluffs overlooking the bridge. From where they were, they could see it all, the creek below, the stone walls of the bridge, and the open field leading up to it. Their rifles and artillery controlled the crossing. Toombs was outnumbered, but the country was with him. He instructed his soldiers, keep them as long as you can, make them pay dearly for every inch. Burnside, though, had his own problems. His troops were weary and hesitant, hours had been lost in indecision, and when the order to advance was finally given, the Union troops gazed across the bridge with terror. They could see the Confederates up above, guns glinting, cannons leveled. It was like marching into a trap. Nevertheless, orders were orders. Somewhere near mid-morning, the initial Union attack started. The 11th Connecticut Regiment infantrymen marched towards the bridge, flags held high. Steadily they marched, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots, hearts thudding in their chests. For one moment, there was pure silence. Then, as if the ground itself broke out, the Confederate line let loose a deluge of fire. Bullets flew through the air, hitting men as stalks of wheat in front of us. Cannonballs burst, shredding stones and steel and tearing through Union lines. The creek babbled with splashes as men staggered into it, their blood coloring its soft current. Those who made it onto the bridge were cut down by withering fire, falling in groups before they could even make it halfway across. One Union survivor afterwards wrote, "It was murder, not war. The enemy had us in their sights as though we were ducks on a pond. Men fell all around me, and still the order was to advance." The bridge itself was a killing funnel. Fewer than a dozen soldiers could march across at a time, an easy target for the Confederate sharpshooters stationed high upon the bluffs. They picked them off with icy accuracy. Union troops crashed into piles on the stonework, bodies piling against the walls, blocking the narrow chasm. The creek below became a maelstrom of dead and dying. Burnside, observing from the back, became impatient. Wave after wave of assaults failed. His troops were courageous, but courage was not enough to overcome such a position. The hours ticked by, and still the Confederates retained possession. Each effort cost hundreds of lives, but the bridge continued to be out of reach. The screams of the injured rose into the air. Men dragged themselves along the banks, holding broken limbs, pleading for water. Officers yelled themselves raw, attempting to bring their men together, but terror of that narrow stone bridge hung over every man who went near it. It was suicide, one man remembered. We all knew it, but still we went. For the Confederates, it was a cold satisfaction of a bitter sort. They were grossly outnumbered, only a handful of 100 men standing in the way of 1,000 or more, but their higher ground made them giants. They reloaded, discharged and reloaded again, resolute to defend the bridge at all costs. One Georgian sharpshooter reportedly had fired more than 100 times that day, each shot finding its mark. They struggled in desperation, aware that their purpose was to gain Lee the time he required to reorganize somewhere else on the battlefield, and time they spent. Almost 3 hours the Union attempted, and was unsuccessful in capturing the bridge. The sun pounded down, smoke thickened, and the dead mounted higher. Antietam Creek, a quiet strip of water, now mirrored horror's blood churning into its flow. dead bodies drifting idly downstream. Finally, Burnside realized brute strength was not sufficient. He dispatched skirmishers upstream in search of a ford with the hope of flanking the Confederate position. Battle there raged hard, but at last, about early afternoon, Union troops succeeded in crossing at various points. New troops charged toward the bridge again, this time by sheer numbers.
Confederate defenders, tired and short on ammunition, faltered. Their killing fire ebbed, and the Union troops advanced with fresh ferocity. They poured onto the bridge, bayonets set, muskets thundering. For the first time that day, the blue tide broke through. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out on the north side. Men wrestled in the dirt, bayoneting, clubbing with rifle butts, scratching at each other in a melee. Confederate troops fought with all their might, but too few, too exhausted. They retreated one by one up the bluffs. Burnside's men did, at last, occupy the bridge. The cost, however, was staggering. The stone crossing was littered with bodies, the walls scarred and stained with blood. Soldiers called it the Bridge of Blood, for it had been won at a price so heavy it defied reason. Nearly 500 Union casualties lay around the span, while the Confederates had lost fewer than half that number. For Burnside, it was an empty victory. Hours were lost, and when his troops forced across and started moving toward Sharpsburg, rebel reinforcements were on hand. Opportunity for crushing victory was lost because the bridge had been too slow, too costly in lives. By evening, Union troops occupied the captured bridge, gazing at the dead. Some quietly cried, some sat in stunned silence, too numb to react. One officer wrote about it. The dead lay so thickly upon it that the bridge itself appeared constructed of men. The water beneath ran red. Never again will I behold such horror. In Sharpsburg, families were huddled in their houses, hearing the constant crash of battle. Once the firing had stopped, they emerged to find that their beautiful countryside was a horror. Mothers and daughters waded through the creek to nurse the wounded, dragging half-alive soldiers out of the water. Farmers hauled the dead off on wagons, their fields now planted with temporary graves. The bridge, once a humble fragment of stonework in countryside Maryland, would never again be viewed in quite the same fashion. It was a monument to both futility and courage, a testament to the stubborn savagery of the Civil War. For its soldiers, the memory lingered. They talked about it with haunted eyes, recalling the screams of men killed on its narrow width, the blood that stained its gray stones red. And for Burnside himself, the bridge became a stain on his name. While his troops had finally captured it, the wait gave Lee time to live through the day. The Union had won land, but not the battle. Ultimately, Burnside's bridge became not only a battlefield, but also a testament to the way terrain, leadership, and raw willpower could determine the destiny of thousands. That day, Antietam Creek bore not only water, it bore the lives of hundreds of hearts, lost in a wave of sacrifice. And that stone bridge in silence was witness to one of the greatest tragedies of the Civil War. It still stands today, preserved in quiet dignity. Tourists walk across it, listening to guides tell the story. Birds sing, and the creek flows peacefully again. But if you listen closely, some say you can still hear the echoes of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, the ghosts of men who gave everything on that narrow crossing. The Bridge of Blood is still a reminder that freedom, solidarity, and survival are achieved at the costliest price. With the sun setting behind the rolling Maryland hills on September 17, 1862, the cacophony of musketry and cannonade gradually gave way to silence. The Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, was coming to its end. But the silence was not peace. It was the haunted, stifling stillness that descends in the aftermath of devastation. What was left on the fields of Sharpsburg was not an army, not a triumph, not even a decided result. What was left was a cemetery, and the moans of the living who were ensnared in it. During the long day, the Union and Confederate forces had lashed at each other with unimagined ferocity. From the Cornfield, to Bloody Lane, to Burnside's bridge, tens of thousands of men had collided, struggled, and died. Now as the night fell, the battlefield was altered. The stalks of corn had been torn into shreds. The fences were splintered, trees shattered, and houses consumed by flames. The very earth itself had been torn asunder by shells and saturated in blood. Antietam Creek, which had been a peaceful ribbon of water, now bore the red of the dead. More than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in one day. It was a figure too great to really understand. Picture an entire town destroyed in less than 12 hours. That was Antietam. The survivors lurched through the wreckage, their eyes empty, their faces smeared with dirt and powder. Some sought out comrades, others simply fell where they were. The wounded were strewn about the fields, wailing for water, for assistance, for their mothers. Some pleaded to have it done quickly, powerless to bear the agony of broken limbs and lacerated flesh. Union stretcher-bearers spread out, lamped with lanterns when the light was gone. They paced from corpse to corpse, debating who might be saved and who was lost. "Leave him," one soldier would say softly, as a man struggled out his last breaths. "Take this fellow, he has a chance." It was an ugly math of survival. The improvised field hospitals were pictures of unimaginable horror. Barns, churches, and farmhouses had been transformed into surgery wards. The wounded were stretched out in rows upon straw, waiting their turn. Surgeons worked inwardly, sleeves stained red to the elbow. Amputations were done with no anesthesia, only chloroform or whiskey if they were fortunate. Limbs were dumped in piles outside the doors, a gruesome mountain of arms and legs that spoke of the fury of the day. One witness described a barn after the battle. The floor was slippery with blood. The moans of the dying rose into the rafters, and outside, the piles of severed limbs grew higher until they seemed like grotesque monuments. Men yelled while saws severed bone. Others remained still, gazing blankly at the ceiling as their life drained from them. Some pleaded with the surgeons to leave their arms or legs intact, believing that living without them would be worse than death. Many did not awaken again. The citizens of Sharpsburg suffered their own horror. Families crept out of their basements to discover that their homes were shot through with bullet holes, their fields turned into rubbish heaps. Civilians moved through the dead, scouring the crowds for relatives or providing what solace they could to strangers. Women fetched buckets of water for the dying, kneeling beside soldiers and holding their hands as they passed away. Children cried as they looked at bodies stacked along fences, their innocence lost in a moment. The odor of death started to ascend with the air of evening. Blood mixed with the bitter smell of gunpowder smoke, producing a vomit-stinking sweetness that lingered everywhere. Flies swarmed in heavy masses around the bodies. Horses were dead alongside the men, their swollen bodies contributing to the horror. Wherever the eye turned, there was destruction. For the troops, night was not a time of rest. Most of the injured lay on the field, too far away from care, suffering through the night. Some crawled for hours, pulling themselves toward the dim light of lanterns, leaving behind streams of blood. Others prayed softly, knowing they would not see morning. Union and Confederate both lay side by side. They groaned in the same pain. In the darkness, whether it was what they wore didn't matter anymore. Their pain was one and the same. There were even soldiers from opposing sides who reached out to each other, giving water from canteens. They exchanged last words as brothers in death. One of the Confederate soldiers would later say, "I was lying in the dark. A Yankee next to me put his canteen to my lips. He didn't say a word, only nodded. We both knew that we would not see dawn." In that moment, we were no longer enemies, we were mere men. For the commanders, the night was one of contemplation. General McClellan, ever conservative, felt he had done his part, driven Lee back, retained the field, but he had not killed Lee's army, and his hesitation would be the subject of criticism in the years to come. General Lee, battered and bruised, had lived. His army remained intact, barely. Both men understood what the statistics indicated. There had been no victory, merely staggering loss. And President Lincoln, patiently in suspense in Washington, would soon discover the horrific losses. He had dreamed of a resounding win, something to empower him to issue his long-awaited Emancipation Proclamation. Antietam would do as a Union victory would be spun, but Lincoln knew the price was not to be borne. As the night wore on after hours, the battlefield itself became strangely quiet. Lanterns cast ghostly glows in the distance, shadows creeping slowly as stretcher-bearers went about their grim task. There was an occasional crack of a musket, or a lone cannon shot, but otherwise, there was silence. Nighttime only brought the occasional low moan of the injured and the far-off cries for water. The moon climbed, casting its silver light upon the fields. In its light, the fields were like great graveyards. Bodies lay in rows, their faces staring toward the sky, their hands frozen over weapons. Flags were crumpled on the ground, muddied and bloodied. Muskets, bent and shattered, lay strewn about like broken playthings. At midnight, burial parties commenced their task. Soldiers armed with shovels dug shallow trenches, often burying dozens of men in one trench. No time for ceremony, no time for prayer. Names were forgotten as men were thrown together, Union and Confederate both, covered hastily with dirt. The terrain was uneven, the trenches too shallow, and in days to come, the rains would bring the bodies out again. But for the time being, it was all they could manage. One Union chaplain wrote of the scene, "I spoke prayers over pits where friend and foe lay together. It was the only mercy we could give them. The earth became their shroud, the stars their final witness." By morning, Sharpsburg was a ghost town. Survivors wandered like specters, burdened with memories they could never shake. Some cursed Antietam, others in hushed tones revered it, but all concurred on one thing that night. When the battlefield lay quiet, the earth itself seemed to be under a curse. For the families at home, letters would soon be coming. Thousands of wives, mothers and children would open mail and read the horrible lines, "Killed in action." For many, no body would ever be home, no grave ever visited. Their loved ones had disappeared into the mass grave plots of Antietam, lost to history but not forgotten. September 17th night was not just an end, it was a transformation. The battlefield was not just a war zone, but a cemetery that stretched miles wide. Every field, every fence, every creek bank was a witness to sacrifice, and for America, the nightfall at Antietam was a warning. It was what Civil War really was, not glory, not honor, but thousands of shattered lives left under the stars. It was the darkest reminder so far of the cost the nation was paying for its division. The guns had gone quiet on September 18, 1862. Antietam's blood still lingered in the earth, the wounded still screamed in barns converted into hospitals, and the dead still rested in shallow graves. But even as the smoke cleared from the field, the full effect of Antietam was just starting. What occurred in those savage hours along Antietam Creek would resonate far beyond Sharpsburg. It would determine the direction of the Civil War, change the destiny of millions, and redefine the definition of America forever. For those who survived, the legacy was inscribed in scars. Thousands went home from the battlefield with broken bodies, missing arms, missing legs, faces seared or mutilated beyond recognition. Many never went home, sentenced to spend the balance of their lives in hospitals or soldiers' homes, relying on charity. They took Antietam with them, both in their wounds and in their memories. Veterans referred to the Cornfield, Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge with haunted eyes. Others were never able to walk through a cornfield again without the sound of muskets in the air, the scent of powder smoke on the wind. That terrible day, their loved ones left behind carried their own legacy. Letters came in towns and villages throughout the Union and the Confederacy, bringing word that husbands, sons and brothers were not coming home. Black crepe draped on innumerable doorways, church bells rang. Mothers cried over folded flags, children were raised without fathers. Towns lost multiple generations of young men. The cost of Antietam was not limited to the battlefield, but extended like a shadow over the earth, inflicting wounds that would never heal completely. But Antietam's legacy was not solely personal, it was deeply political. President Abraham Lincoln had been looking for an opening, a victory he could employ to declare a bold new war purpose. Only days after the battle, he took advantage of the moment. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Up until then, the Civil War had formally been fought to save the Union, and now, with the stroke of Lincoln's pen, it was a war of freedom. The proclamation announced that from January 1, 1863, on, all slaves in the Confederate States shall be thenceforward and forever free.
It did not emancipate all slaves at once, but it changed the war. No longer was it North versus South, it was slavery versus freedom. Without Antietam, this day may never have arrived. Lincoln had been patiently awaiting a Union win to declare emancipation on the heels of a loss would have appeared desperate. Antietam was not a decisive victory, but it sufficed. Lee's invasion of the North had been repulsed. The Union controlled the field. Lincoln could move with assurance. The world noticed. European powers, especially Britain and France, had been weighing whether to grant recognition to the Confederacy as a nation. Their economies were reliant on cotton from the South, and recognition would have given the Union a fatal blow. But following Antietam and Lincoln's proclamation, the equation had shifted. How could Britain, where abolitionist sentiment was so high, uphold a nation in the cause of holding on to slavery? The Confederacy missed its best opportunity for foreign recognition. Antietam had not only rescued the Union on the battlefield, it had defended it diplomatically as well. The Emancipation Proclamation also changed the makeup of the Union Army itself, with freedom now as a stated war objective. Previously enslaved men were able to enlist. By the war's end, almost 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors had served the Union cause, their valor establishing beyond question that they were not merely fighting to win their own freedom, but for the future of the nation. Antietam thus opened the way for the remaking of the Union Army into a genuinely diverse army of freedom. But even as Lincoln moved with boldness, there was also tragedy in the shadow of Antietam. General McClellan, with his numbers superior, had not destroyed Lee's army. His wariness, his perpetual assumption that he was outmatched, had taken its toll on the Union. Lincoln, angry to the point of frustration, soon relieved him of command. McClellan's defeat at Antietam would taint his legacy forever. He had won sufficient to provide Lincoln with an opportunity, but he had lost the opportunity to conclude the war in advance. For the Confederates, Antietam was at once a defeat and a dismal reassurance. Lee had failed to drive north and secure recognition, but his army had made it through. Outnumbered, weary and bruised, the Army of Northern Virginia slipped south across the Potomac into safety. Southerners would recall Antietam as evidence of Lee's genius, that even against overwhelming numbers, his army had held, but the cost was unbearable. Thousands of Confederate families grieved, their men buried in shallow graves far from home. The South's manpower, already stretched thin, bled heavily at Antietam. It was a blow from which it could not easily recover. And then there was the land itself. The fields of Sharpsburg, once quiet farmland, were changed forever. The Miller family's cornfield never grew the same again. Travelers who came after the war reported that the ground still felt haunted, as though the earth itself remembered. Farmers tilled bullets and bones for generations. Streams carried away scraps of uniform, belt buckles and teeth. The land had entered the national consciousness, a memorial to both horror and greatness. The photographs likewise bore the burden. For the first time in history, Americans witnessed the war dead not in art or idealized drawings, but in harsh, unromanticated photographs. Alexander Gardner's images of Antietam dead were exhibited in New York, stunning the public. Men were strewn across trenches, their faces contorted in pain, their bodies stiff already. The photos stripped away illusions of glory. War was no longer something far away and abstract. It was real, bloody, and awful. Antietam brought the war into American living rooms, something words could never do. Perhaps Antietam's biggest legacy was not political or military, but moral. During those slaughter hours, America witnessed the full extent of what it meant to be divided against itself. Brothers fighting brothers, neighbors against neighbors, a country tearing itself down. Antietam was a mirror held up, showing the grim reality. The Civil War was more than a fight over land or dominance. It was a fight for the United States soul. That evening, after the fight, the survivors described the unnatural silence. They said it was as though the ground itself wept. The screams of the injured could be heard in the distance. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, and yet there was quiet. Men who had witnessed the greatest atrocities of the day gazed up at the stars and wondered whether or not the nation could heal. Years afterward, veterans returned to Antietam, old men now, white beards and slouching backs. They tramped the fields where they had fought. They laid flowers on comrades' graves. Some shook hands with former foes. They stood at the Cornfield, at Bloody Lane, at Burnside's Bridge, and recalled the day their world had almost ended. The record of Antietam is inscribed in all these things, in Lincoln's proclamation, in the images of the slain, in the altered trajectory of diplomacy, and in the haunted faces of the survivors. It was a Union turning point, a Confederate defeat, and a national awakening, but most of all, Antietam's legacy is a warning. It warns that civil war is not glory, it is carnage, that division, if left untended, can unravel a nation from the inside out. And that freedom, once given birth and blood, must never be assumed. Now, the field is still. The corn regrows, the creek runs softly, and tourists tread the trails with cameras rather than guns. They study markers, listen to park rangers, and attempt to conceptualize the unconceivable. The earth is healed, but not the memory. Each year the National Park Service sets thousands of candles, a single candle for every victim that day. The field is illuminated with light, a respectful monument to sacrifice. The men who perished at Antietam are no more, but their legacy remains. Their pain provided Lincoln with the opportunity to redefine the war. Their sacrifice ensured that the Union would fight for more than just survival, that they would fight for freedom. Their sacrifice was the building block of a new America, one still struggling to this very day to live up to the promise of liberty for all. Antietam was more than the Civil War's darkest day. It was the day that redefined the fate of a nation.